One word for everything. You hear it everywhere now. Tired all the time? Inflammation. Brain fog? Inflammation. Joint pain, gut issues, low mood, weight gain, random aches, feeling off for no clear reason? Somehow, still inflammation. And after a while, it starts to sound like one hidden answer behind half of modern life, which is exactly why it gets so persuasive. It feels neat, it feels scientific, and it feels like it explains something real. The problem is, it only explains part of it. Inflammation is not the villain. Because inflammation is not one bad thing floating around your body causing chaos. It is not like rust, it is not like poison, and it is not a single villain hiding underneath every health problem. Inflammation is a response. More specifically, it is one of the body's fast response modes when something looks threatening. That could be an infection, an injury, damaged cells, or tissue under stress. That shift makes the whole topic much easier to understand. People often talk about inflammation as if it were the problem itself. But most of the time, it is the body reacting to something else. And that also explains why one word can seem to fit so many different situations. A cut on your finger, an arthritic joint, a stressed blood vessel, and a lingering infection do not share one single cause. But they can all trigger versions of the same basic response pattern. Blood vessels change. Chemical signals go out. Immune cells move in. And the tissue shifts from normal function into defense and repair. Same general language. Very different stories. Why the body uses it at all? And that brings up the obvious question. If inflammation can be so uncomfortable, and sometimes so damaging, why does the body use it at all? Because in a real threat, speed matters more than elegance. If bacteria get into tissue, or cells start breaking apart, or a barrier gets damaged, the body cannot sit back and wait for perfect information. It has to act early, with incomplete data. So it uses a system that is fast, broad, and a little messy. Better to overreact slightly to a possible threat than underreact to a real one. That is the trade-off. And this is where a lot of people quietly absorb the wrong idea. They start thinking inflammation is just a design flaw. But no inflammation at all would be much worse. You would be slower to contain infections, slower to clear damaged material, slower to start repair. So the body is not being irrational here. It is solving an urgent problem under uncertainty. That does not make the response harmless. But it does mean the response exists for a reason. The part people miss. It's supposed to end. Now here's the second big thing people miss. Healthy inflammation is supposed to be temporary. It is not just on or off. It has a full arc. First, the body detects trouble. Then, it responds. Then, if things go well, it shifts into cleanup and resolution. The trigger gets cleared. Short-lived inflammatory signals fade. Cells that rushed in early are removed. Other cells help clean the area and guide repair. In other words, the body is not only built to start inflammation, it is also built to finish it. When inflammation becomes chronic. And that matters, because chronic inflammation is not just normal inflammation hanging around too long like a guest who forgot to leave. It is often a different state. Sometimes the original trigger never fully goes away. Sometimes tissue keeps getting stressed. Sometimes cleanup is incomplete. Sometimes the immune system starts reacting to the wrong target. And when that happens, the response stops being a short emergency program and starts becoming part of the tissue's normal background. The body is no longer dealing with one event. It is adapting to a new baseline. That shift can be hard to notice because it often looks less dramatic than acute inflammation. A swollen ankle is obvious. A low-grade inflammatory state is not. It may not feel hot or look red. Instead, it can show up as slower changes. Changes in metabolism, changes in appetite, fatigue, vascular stress, disrupted signaling, tissue that just stops working as smoothly as it used to. Acute inflammation can unfold over hours or days. Chronic low-grade inflammation can shape the body over months or years. Same broad system. Completely different lived experience. Why it shows up in so many problems. And this is one reason inflammation gets blamed for so much. It really does show up across a huge range of conditions. In metabolic disease, immune activity in stressed fat tissue can contribute to broader dysfunction. In aging, low-grade inflammatory signaling becomes easier to sustain. In cardiovascular disease, inflammatory pathways can be part of how plaques become dangerous. So when people say inflammation is involved, they are often not wrong. The mistake is what they assume that word means. Because involved is not the same as original cause. That distinction matters a lot. Smoke can tell you there is a fire. It does not tell you what started it. And inflammation often works like that. It can be a driver in some diseases, a consequence in others, and part of a feedback loop in many. Sometimes it is part of the damage. Sometimes it is part of the attempted repair. Sometimes it is both at once. So when someone says, the real issue is inflammation, that can be true, partly true, or very incomplete depending on what level of the story they are talking about. Why just lower inflammation is too simple. A good example of this shows up in cardiovascular disease. Inflammatory pathways are clearly relevant there. That is real. But even there, not every anti-inflammatory approach works the same way. Not every pathway matters equally. And not every useful treatment works simply because it lowers inflammation in some broad general sense. So even in one disease area where inflammation clearly matters, just lower inflammation is still too vague to be a full explanation. That corrects another common misunderstanding. If inflammation matters, then lowering it broadly must always help. Not necessarily. The immune system is not one dial. It is a network. The pathway that protects tissue in one context may contribute to damage in another. The response that helps early may become costly later. And a treatment that changes one inflammatory signal may leave the real driver untouched. Biology is usually more specific than the headline version. The blood test problem. There is also the blood test problem. People often see a marker like CARP and treat it like a direct readout of the whole situation. But a marker of inflammatory activity is not the same as a complete explanation of why that activity is happening. It can be useful. It can be meaningful. But it is not a magic decoder ring for everything wrong in the body. A signal is not the same as a source. Why this idea spread so easily. And psychologically, this is part of why the idea spread so well. Inflammation feels like a hidden layer beneath the chaos. It turns a messy set of symptoms into one clean story. And human beings like that. We like one underlying explanation because it makes uncertainty feel smaller. But bodies are not always organized around one elegant cause. Sometimes many different problems pass through the same response system. And that makes the response look more central than it really is. The cleaner way to see it. So the cleanest way to think about all of this is probably this. Inflammation is not the master cause behind everything. It is the body's emergency mode. A fast, useful, costly mode. It shows up often because infection, injury, stress, and damage are common biological problems. And when that mode resolves properly, it is part of how we heal. When it stays on, keeps getting retriggered, or becomes woven into the background, it can start shaping disease instead of just responding to it. So when you hear that something is just inflammation, the better move is not to dismiss it. And it is not to worship the explanation either. It is to ask a better question. Inflammation of what? Triggered by what? For how long? Doing what? Because that is where the real story usually begins. The useful reframe is simple. Inflammation is less like a hidden villain and more like the body's alarm and repair system. And the reason it gets blamed for everything is that alarms go off in many different emergencies, even when the emergency itself is not the same.